So much of the work that I do as a counselor and with Church Wellco and with all the brave spaces that we create, the individual spaces, the brave training spaces, and the brave communal spaces, because they orient around bravery and heavy things in life, it is inevitable that fairly quickly into the conversation, the topic or the concept of the experience of grief and loss emerge, whether we're talking about lost relationships or lost loved ones or lost churches and lost ministries and lost callings. And there's so many different experiences of grief and loss that emerge over the course of time. And when the topic of grief comes up, I make a very specific and intentional distinction that I think matters a great deal to how we walk through it and how we even understand the pain that we carry. And that distinction is pulling apart grief and lament. And both grief and lament sit under this category of the experience of mourning. This is how we go through, this is how we mourn difficult things. And grief is how we mourn things that we have lost, things that were, that are no longer, things that were present and now are absent, things that matter, that are no longer accessible, that we lose dreams, or there is a grieving, we mourn things that are lost. With pastors, we talk about like when someone is in your church and you're relying on them and you're building a ministry with them and then they just vanish and disappear. Like this is a moment of grief that they've experienced. So grief is how we mourn things that we have lost. Lament is actually how we mourn things that were that never should have been, or things that never were that ought to have been. Right? So using even that example that the first time someone that's deeply in your life and involved in your community leaves, you grieve that. The 10th time that happens, the 12th time that happens, the 15th time that happens, when someone who is an active part of your life, the someone you relied on, is suddenly absent and you're going through this experience again, we're no longer grieving the loss of something. We're actually lamenting an ongoing experience that was never supposed to be. The betrayal and the loss and the cycling through, like this is an example of something that was never part of God's designed plan for us to attach, to connect, to grow together, and then to suddenly have that dissipate around us. And it is a particular kind of pain and loss. And so grief is how we mourn things that we have lost. Lament is how we mourn things that never were that ought to have been, or things that were but never were. When we talk about trauma, when we talk about abuse, we're not talking about grieving just an experience, although there is a great deal of grief in there. We're talking about, I experienced things that I should never have experienced. Or those of us who grew up in family systems that we needed things from our parents that we didn't get from them. We're not grieving that. That is an experience of lament, of going, I was in a context where I was supposed to experience formation and life and care, and that was never given to me. And there's a perpetual ongoing challenge that comes, a perpetual reoccurring pain that is experienced because something that was supposed to be wasn't, or because something that wasn't supposed to be was. And so we sit in this experience of lament. And so even though they both sit in mourning around pain, grief is how we process and navigate mourning things that we have lost. And lament is how we process and navigate things that weren't but ought to have been, or were that ought not to have been. And there's an injustice and a progressiveness and an ongoing nature in that. And that distinction allows us to orient to the pain, to answer some of the questions about why does the pain that we think we grieved, why does the thing that we thought we lost, and we're still hurt from it, and we're still experiencing, and the chances are it's because it's not a singular experience, that it's something that actually has reoccurred, or it has an ongoing progressive impact on life, which actually moves us to a spot where we need to lament this. There's a recognition of its ongoing impact on our lives, that we don't just grieve, we actually sit in places of lament.